Hello and welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Jim Rugg, and a very different episode today. We're going to talk with Sean Michael Robinson about digital file preparation, scanning, printing. He got on my radar with his work on The Strange Death of Alex Raymond with Carson Grubal and Dave Sim, and I have been seeing print pieces of this project for the last year or so of extremely fine lines reproduced in as good a quality as I have seen line art reproduced. And so talking to Carson over the last year has led me to Sean, and I'm very excited, hopefully to learn some new tricks and up my game, but also something that I think, we have a lot of creators that watch Cartoonist Kayfabe. I think this may be very good information for anybody who's aspiring to create line art and to reproduce that line art, color art, whatever the case may be. But that's what I hope to get into with this conversation. So Sean Michael Robinson, welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. And can we begin with maybe a quick professional biography of you? What brought you to this point? What have you done? What should people know about the work that you've made? Because you seem like a Renaissance guy.
Yeah, that's another way of saying that I haven't been able to stick with one thing for longer than a couple of years. I've had an interesting, 20 years of work under my belt at this point. I started off as a musician and played a bunch of different instruments, and have sort of, I taught high school art and tried out a lot of different things and sort of tried a sort of safer path for a while. But then in 2010, it was, I quit my high school art job and decided I was going to finish a graphic novel I've been working on. I had done a couple hundred pages of that. And somewhere in the mix there, I published a article that went viral that was discussing The Wire. It was co-written with a friend of mine, Joey Delaria. And this thing was, this thing that we wrote in an afternoon and I drew a couple pictures for was, seen by more people than will ever see anything else that I'll ever touch in my life. And it was a weird experience and sort of got me into a lot of different types of, different channels. And so one of those channels, I had done some interviews at that point for the Comics Journal. I had talked to Gerhard, who is Dave Sim's co-artist on Cerebus. And I had talked to Dave a couple times on the phone, and I had kind of tried to persuade Dave that I'd like to do an interview with him about his comic techniques. And, Dave is a fascinating guy. He can talk about anything related to comics forever. And, we had a chat one post-Christmas day where he just basically told me why there would never be baseball comics in North America. And, listening to Dave Sim talk about baseball comics for 45 minutes is the type of thing that persuades you, okay, I'm doing the right thing here. Anyway, so I had kind of kept in touch with him. And at a certain point in 2014, he was having an issue with a new printing of the first two volumes of Cerebus, High Society. And he put out a sort of all points bulletin to, this fan blog for Cerebus is basically like, how can we fix this problem? The printer is telling me that it's the problem with the files. The person who prepped the files is telling me it's a problem with the printer. What is it that we're going to do? And I wrote a few responses to that. And, they were forwarded by the guy who was writing the blog. And, I kept on writing responses that kind of got more and more heated. And this was just sort of basically the knowledge that I had at this point, having prepped a book for print. I had done this book, Down in the Hole. I had done the illustrations and I was the co-author of it. And, I had had the kind of disappointing print experience of getting your artwork back and seeing all these teeny tiny lines sort of turn into this halftone gray mush. And had done some research based on that, and also had been really influenced by Dave's talking about reproduction and Glamourpuss, and had been really thinking about, the art of the line. And, what does it mean to draw something on paper and then get that transmitted to other people? And it struck me as kind of weird that we live in this society where we have technologically evolved in all these different ways, and yet some things look worse. Printing looks worse, and we live in an era where most books look worse than they did before. How could it be that the things are improving, the technology is improving, but the product is not? And, some of it could just be that people didn't care about it, but there must be something else to it. So Dave was basically like, okay, well, look, you're the guy. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, you're in charge of this project now. I'm going to pay you. We've got this Kickstarter. We've raised X amount of money. It was a large amount of money. I'm going to pay you your illustration rate, which at the time, it was $50 an hour. And I said, look, you want me to do something other than write you tech stuff? I need to be paid. Instead of drawing, I'm going to be doing this for you. So, and I imagined this was going to be this short project where I was just going to learn about it. I was going to tell him what to do, and then I was going to go away, and he was going to be able to put together, his 6,000 page graphic novel in a meaningful way. And it turned out instead that I learned a hell of a lot in a brief period of time, and basically dug into everything there was to know about line art reproduction, everything there was to know about color reproduction, everything there was to know about the previous generation of print technologies, and just basically soaked all this stuff up and tried to turn myself into a sponge where I was going to take in all of that information. And I have a background in audio engineering, and that's one of the only things that I've done that I actually went to school for. My background in audio engineering, having recorded a dozen albums and, produced things and engineered things and arranged things, had given me a good framework for taking a complex task and breaking it down into smaller, manageable pieces. And I sort of set out a roadmap. This is how we're going to do this thing. And Dave wanted to do it the very best way possible, which meant that for the past 7 years, on and off, every time a book is up, I go through every single available resource for this project. I go through the photo negatives that we have. I go through the original art that we have. I go through other people's scans of original art that fans that have them on their wall have taken them in and got them scanned at the local Kinko's or whatever. And some cases I use print sources, and I take all of this and try to turn it into the most faithful, cohesive book that is possible. So I've been doing this Cerebus restoration project for 7 years now. I've restored about 4,700 pages, something like that. I'm hoping to do the last 1,300 pages in the next 4 months or so here, because I've got a graphic novel I'm working on. But basically, I have learned just about everything there is to know at the moment about working for print. And, for most people, that's pretty useless knowledge. Like, I feel sometimes like I'm the, steal something from Dave. I feel sometimes like I'm the guy who built an Eiffel Tower out of toothpicks, because you can tell somebody at a party like, oh, yeah, I know this this thing. And they're like, okay. And
yeah, if you're not actually doing this and applying it, if you're not a working cartoonist that maybe is prepping your art yourself, I can see how this is not going to be the most exciting conversation for most party goers, no doubt about it. Wow, that's a lot. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's great. This is exactly what I want to talk about, Sean. This is wonderful. And I'm trying to think about like keeping everybody up with what's going on. I'd like to plug Down in the Hole, your book. Is that still available for print? In print?
Yeah. It's if you haven't read The Wire, and if you haven't read the novels of Charles Dickens and Thackeray, I don't know if it's going to be up your alley. That might be the issue with it as far as a commercial product, is the Venn diagram of people who are really into The Wire and Vanity Fair is like this tiny little sliver.
Well, it's an interesting project. I mean, I would also suggest, if you're interested in fan art, which is something I'm very interested in, it's kind of an interesting piece from that angle as well. You mentioned that whenever that comes out, you weren't happy with the reproduction. Did you revise that then and do a subsequent printing? Were you able to like correct that in some way?
No, and the main issue with that is that I had it published by somebody else. So this was not published by me. This was published by a publisher in New York, and they basically wanted to cut their losses. They didn't do any promo for it. All the promo that happened was because of me and Joy pounding the pavement, and I think that basically they were fairly disinterested in it. Once they got past the initial stage, it was supposed to be a rush book, and we wrote and drew the entire thing in a 6-week period.
Wow.
Which is, it's a 200-page book or whatever. And, 45, 50 illustrations, something, while I was doing the music for a play, during the day. I mean, it went from a rush job to a back of the burner, job as far as the publisher was concerned. And I think at some point, I think the terms of the contract, I could probably take it back and do another new printing. But at this point, I'm
Probably
trying
in
to.
all of your free time.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's the other thing. We could be talking about multitasking based on the descriptions that you've laid down so far of what you're doing and what's keeping you busy. Um, Shifting, back to the Cerebus project and
Yeah.
sort of, I guess, creating a print document or a master printing file of Cerebus. It's very interesting to me because I think a lot of cartoonists and probably a lot of comic book publishers have this issue where they have these archives that are sort of pre-digital, and most of us don't know what we're doing when it comes to scanning, printing, any of this stuff. It feels like it's something that like comics history could benefit from, this type of knowledge being applied to, so much of comics history in America, at least, is 20th century, and a lot of that work was not prepared digitally, or a kind of a master print file prepared for those things.
Well,
Have people come up, have companies, publishers approached you about this, or other cartoonists approached you about this?
so I have had talks with a few people, very ad hoc. Most publishers that I have talked to, if I've been in a meeting or whatever, seem to think that the only thing I can do is this laborious, you know, I really, we did the Cerebus thing. This is paid for by fans. This is the most laborious thing you can possibly do. Like, how can you make the very best thing? And I don't want to, I won't go into all the details about what it is that actually, um, but basically, like, I think that people get the impression that that's what you do. That, well, they don't want that. A publisher wants to have it done immediately. And the thing is that the resources that you don't have there's lots of different ways you can choose to do a job like that. This is essentially like the Beach Boys project, where they've gone back to the original multi-tracks and they've restitched everything back together in order to just make that mix just slightly better. Whereas what you can just do as a publisher is you can go back to your physical files and you can make the best scans of the negative possible. These are really efficient things to do. These are things that an intern can do, just basically like the monkey work of scanning it all in. But I'm not persuaded that a lot of publishers have actually kept their physical assets. Um, uh, the feeling that I get from a lot of this stuff, crawling around in a warehouse in outside of LA and finding a bunch of Marvel negatives, not owned by Marvel, like literally in the hands of somebody who's like basically a t-shirt salesman, has persuaded me that these companies don't have their physical assets. I think what has happened is a lot of them were persuaded by people at the print company that the one-off scan that they made back in 1997 or whenever things really started to switch over was good enough. And so you have these like Marvel Masterwork books that just look like, I mean, toilet paper, with put through I mean, there's something called the copy dot process that you'll encounter a lot when you start talking to print professionals about this stuff. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, these negs were done copy dot. And what copy dot means is that these negatives that have a very rich, this is an amazing process that people invented over time to be able to photograph original art for line art and be able to, these original negatives, when you hold them in their hand. In fact, I can go grab a Cerebus one out of the closet if you want to see it. You can actually see a lot of variation in the lightness and darkness, even though they're intended to reproduce, just light and just dark. The on press people could push them photographically to basically like enhance the amount of detail in the dark areas and things along those lines. You can do the same things when you're scanning them. But what was done when a lot of these were sort of bulk converted is they were scanned directly to bitmap. That means that they were converted directly to 1-bit images. And that means that you lose any flexibility. You can't resize anything that had mechanical tone or half toning on it without getting horrible moire patterns. You're locked into the resolution that it was scanned at. You're locked into the exposure that it was scanned at. And what I found with the Cerebus stuff is that of the 16 books of Cerebus, the printer had converted 5 of them, I think, and they had thrown out the negatives for 3 of them. Just thrown them in the trash. They ended up in a skid, a garbage skid. And if Dave hadn't had somebody to come in and say, well, hold on, don't do that. I mean, he had talked to the people at the printer, and they're like, yeah, unless you want something the size of a billboard, this is going to be fine. And, you know, he trusted the professionals who were working on it. But of course, the professionals have a vested interest in just getting the job off the desk and getting it out the door. And there's a lot of, I don't want to attribute it all to bad faith either, but there's a lot of, let's say, lore around print processes. And you will hear, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I've heard from somebody working at a print factory, well, human beings can't X. Well, the human eye can't Y. Well, this can't X, this can't Y. There's just a whole list of things. And what it basically boils down to is the people who worked in print in the pre-digital age were very high paid professionals with very technical skills. And then the margins got slimmer and slimmer during that digital process, and it pruned all of those high paid people, and it replaced them with people who were more like somebody who just works in an office, and their office happens to have a giant machine that's makes books. And I don't mean that as a knock on people. I mean, nobody has to care about this stuff. It's not like the end of the world. But I mean, it bugs me. I think that these physical resources should be preserved. So when I'm working on a project, I'm scanning things in multi-state. I'm keeping all of these stages. My goal is that somebody, an archivist who really cares about this 200 years from now, could look through all these digital files and do something completely different, than make totally different decisions than the ones I made. Anyway, that's a long way around saying, yes, I would love to do this type of thing on a consulting basis. But I think when people see the results of what see the things I've done so far, they're intimidated by the idea that the process took so long. Not knowing that, of course, that I could just batch process lots of this stuff. I write batch scripts for everything that I do, so that the computer is doing as much work as possible. And working from negatives alone is easy peasy. It doesn't take more effort to do it the right way. That's the frustrating thing when it comes to things like the physical stuff. It doesn't take more effort to do it the right way. It just takes more knowledge beforehand.
That's the part that I find frustrating with a lot of the reprints of, let's say, Marvel and DC. I'm sure they're not the only ones guilty of this, but a lot of that work is this cherished, beloved kind of stuff. And I'll see reprints and there's a reprint editor credited. Sometimes they even do an intro. And then you start looking and it's like, even the paper choice is a bad choice. That would have taken half of a second to spec a different paper that would have, made the work be a little bit more flattering to the work. That frustrates me to no end. I often wonder, what is this person actually doing if it seems like every creative choice is a bad one here.
Right.
But I don't want to get too far off of this direction. The other thing before we dive into the actual process and maybe some recommendations you have for all of us in terms of scanning, what to look for, what to do. The first thing that comes to my mind is art restoration. Comics are such this bastard child of art and literature that there are these fields that really cherish reproduction and restoration and archiving. And I wonder if that was somewhere that you found some of the information that you said you kind of dove in deep and just learned everything that you could about this. Is that one of the fields that you learned from?
Yeah, I have an art history background, and that aspect is very interesting to me. Carson and I have talked a lot about art restoration. I get it easy in a way because everything I'm doing is digital. I haven't gone over to Kitchener, Ontario and persuaded Dave to rip off a bunch of screen tones so I can digitally retone it or something like that. Although, he might do it if it made it look better. But it's interesting that doing this digitally, the heat's off in a certain way. But yeah, there's a huge amount to learn from that field. And also I've taken a lot of inspiration from, like I mentioned before, the Beach Boys project. I'm
really glad you said that, because I have friends who are musicians and into music, and they talk about how these things are mastered for different things. Right. What sounds great on a record is sort of mastered for that record, for the vinyl. And it's not necessarily adjusted whenever people shift to making CDs, in the 90s or something. And as a result, it's not the same. It's not it's not the equivalent, or one does sound better than the other because it's built for that particular media.
Yeah, 100%. The money that was in audio was at the time meant that people really did think about these things in a, I think, more comprehensive way. And you had, like you have the master, what's called the flat master. It's like a pre-master for any medium. And then you have these what are called pre-emphasis masters that were made for an LP. And they had the bass rolled off and had the high end accentuated. And when these record companies first started re-releasing stuff on CD, they just take the pre-emphasis master, because that's the one that they'd used before, and they just put that out as the CD release. And everybody wonders, well, why does CD sound like garbage? But the truth is that the digital medium doesn't have any kind of flavor to it at all. But people learned that, oh, this digital thing sounds so harsh. It sounds like this. It sounds like that. And a lot of it just had to do with people not really going back to the source. The source should be the actual flat master. And then, you have people like, I wish I could remember his name, Mark Lynette, I believe his name is, who worked on the Beach Boys project for the first time in the late 90s, who was like, oh my gosh, this Pro Tools thing, I can go back to these pre-bounced Beach Boys mixes and I can combine them with the later stages that they did, and we could just do another remix. And, he did this and basically set out this meticulous process for how do you take all of these different analog elements and basically use the very best of the technology to combine these things in a way that makes the thing more like the thing. That's the sort of goalpost that I have when I'm working on the art restoration. How do you make the thing more like the thing? You never want to make it less like the thing. You don't want to go through and, I don't know exactly what the equivalent would be, but you always want it to look like, how did this artist envision it was going to be in the printed, in the actual printed form. And so the way it left their artboard should be the sort of guidepost for you.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things, and I think it was in Glamour Puss, is as Dave Sim is sort of exploring techniques of different newspaper cartoonists, he will get into this idea of some of the hatching that's there is in order to limit what, say, the engraver can adjust, right? If there's some fine lines, you can only do so much adjustment without ruining those. And so at least in Glamour Puss, he puts forth this idea that some of these artists would find these ways to control the engraver so that the art wasn't reproduced too dark or too light, pushed too far out of their control, which is, again, fascinating to, I don't know, 7 of us, but to the 7 of us that are interested, it's really interesting, because look, I mostly make my own comics, and that means I'm doing everything I can up to handing them to the printer in many cases. So any way that I can make that output or that finished piece look better or look more the way I want it to look, I mean, that's hugely valuable to me. And even if you're not an independent cartoonist, more and more people that work at Marvel and DC and Image, wherever it is, you are sending your files in digitally. It's no longer, here's the original art on paper, you guys take care of it. It's more and more of like, here's the file. So, up to that point, like, you're responsible for, delivering the best file possible. And that's really what I want to get into.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. So, I mean, the two things I want to say right off the top is that you were talking about two different things when you were talking about line art and when you're talking about color or grayscale reproduction. So we have a different set of limitations and a different set of things to watch out for. So basically, when we were talking about line art, I mean, we all know what line art is because we all did it, in the sand with a stick, or with a piece of charcoal on the sidewalk, or when we were a little kid, then you get the pen for the first time and you're like, oh, look at this line, that visceral connection with the line. There are actual physiological reasons for it. Your vision is more perceptive and sharper when it comes to edges. And basically, the harder the edge is and the higher the contrast it is, the more sensitive you are to nuance of that. And so because of that, and because of the sort of general processes that we have, it's really important that line art be reproduced without a halftone process. And what that means is that basically the little lines on the plate should correspond directly to the lines that you made on the paper. They shouldn't be filtered through any kind of halftone process at all. And this is such a basic thing, but it is amazing to me the amount of product out there. This is an appropriate use of the word product, I think, where somebody didn't get the memo on this. And what happens when you halftone line art is you get a very weak kind of watered down thing. And I think you lose some of that visceral connection to it as well. And so when you as the cartoonist are making these lines, you have to sort of hold it on faith that they're going to get to the printed paper. But each of these steps that you go along, you have to really shepherd and work on retaining that. So basically the first step is to make sure that you get a good color scan of your artwork. With the Cerebus project and with the Strange Death of Alex Raymond, because of the size they were working at, as a general rule, they were both working at basically like a 10 by 15 on an 11 by 17 sheet. And so Dave's originals were all scanned in 600 pixels per inch in color. And then Carson's originals, some of them were at 600 pixels per inch and some of them were 1,200 pixels per inch, which is overkill for almost everything. But if you've seen Carson's pages in that book, you'll know why we did it that way, because it is absurd what he can do with a brush. He brought him over to my house and it was fun to just hang out anyway. So it didn't matter if it took 4 times longer to scan it. Just a general rule, if you're going to work to reduce something, that 600 pixels per inch in color is going to be a good way to do it. And then basically what you're going to do after that is toss out the color channel and reduce it to a grayscale file, and you're going to scale it up to the size you're actually going to print it at. I say scale it up even though you're reducing it. So in the case of like a Cerebus original, they were originally reduced to 60% of the original art size. So, you drawn 10 by 15 and then eventually reduced to like 6 inches, right? 60%. So in Photoshop, I'm using usually bicubic as the upscale method. And I'm doing that 60% of, and then I'm changing the resolution to 2,400 pixels per inch. This is the part where you start freaking people out, because this 2,400 pixels per inch is not a standard recommended resolution. But the thing is, when we first got into this Cerebus project, I really did tests on every single thing that was going to be in the series, because I wanted to make sure that from the first page that I produced, everything in the series was going to be able to reproduce that way. And basically, there was some teeny tiny tone that they had used in the book Jaka's Story. This like 10% tone in the background of a whole sequence of the book, and I just was persuaded there's just no way this fits in a resolution space that is the sort of recommended resolution. You always hear people say, okay, 1,200 pixels per inch. This is the space that you work in with line art. That's the maximum. I talked to a friend of mine who is a press person in Seattle, and basically asked him, like, when you guys make printing plates, what's the resolution that the print plate is actually made at? Like, what does the plate setter work at? What's the resolution? And he said, 2,400 pixels per inch. And basically almost every print shop, this is what their plate set is actually made at. So they have this thing called a plate setter that's making the actual printing plate from the files. All those plate setters, unless you work at a specialty print shop that does like micro printing, like security tags and things like that, they max out at 2,400 pixels per inch. So the reason that someone's submitting a file at 1,200 is because that's a multiple of that destination number. And so basically I was like, okay,
can I pause 1 second here?
Sure.
What you're referring to in terms of line art would be bitmap. Is that right?
It gets converted to bitmap at the final stage. Yeah.
Okay. So we're still in a grayscale whenever we're at 2,400 pixels per inch. All right. Okay.
Yeah. And that's a large document. It's not a slow document. If you're working in grayscale, if you were doing this in color, it would be ridiculous. There's no reason to work in color at that resolution. So I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, I think, without giving the necessary background. Basically, like when you're halftoning something, the resolution doesn't have to be nearly as high. And the reason for that is because the halftone process, you're taking and creating little dots that are making up the entirety of the image, and that softens your view of that object. But line art, you don't have that same kind of advantage. Well, I mean, it's a disadvantage and an advantage, but basically, like your color perception is so different than your line art perception that those resolution issues matter a lot more. So basically, when we first, I just decided, look, Dave, this sequence in the book needs to be 2,400 pixels per inch. There's no reason that we shouldn't do the entire book that way. It's not really, other than some storage space things, there's no reason not to do it. It's not slower. It doesn't change anything. I might have to persuade the printer to keep it at that resolution. But, we should be working with a printer that we can trust anyway. So what does it matter, right? And what we found after the first book, the first book was printed pretty poorly, and you didn't really see any benefit from that because the printer did such a poor job. But we switched printers for the second book, and I just could not believe the difference it made with the actual fine line. And basically, like, you're taking this, when you're talking about doubling the resolution, you're talking about having 4 times the amount of information. Because if you can imagine, like, instead of something being made of 1 square, it's made of 4 squares instead. So you're quadrupling the amount of pixels that are representing this. And the actual files that you're delivering are still teeny tiny. So basically, like, you bring it up to the file size that you're going to want to do, and then you try to overcome the next hurdle, and that is getting everything sharp enough so that all of the edge information is going to survive making it into a bitmap, making it into a 1-bit image. And I say a 1-bit image, that means that every pixel is either on or it's off. It's either black or it's white. You have to do this so that the print plate itself can just be the image or not the image. This is like a finalization, right? But the thing is, you shouldn't do that until you've made all of the adjustments that you need to make. That means bringing it up to size. That means sharpening, which we'll get into, I think, when we do the screen share, if you got time for it.
Yes, yeah.
And everything like that. And basically, if you think about it, what you're actually butting up against here is the reason you make it that large line art space, the large resolution space, is so that the finest of those details can look as most like themselves as possible. So, if you draw a big chunky marker drawing, and you do it with like an extra large Sharpie, and it ends up looking like Mike Mignola took off his glasses, it is not going to matter a lick whether your resolution is 600 pixels per inch bitmap or 1,200 pixels per inch bitmap or a 2,400 pixels per inch bitmap, because there's no fine lines to not resolve. In other words, the frequency of your information matters. And so I sort of stumbled into this just because of the dot tone thing. I just sort of stumbled into this basically being like, well, why can't you reproduce these little dots? I mean, the printer makes halftones all the time where the dots are just that fine. Why does it, where's the difference? And the difference is that people aren't delivering their line art files at a high enough resolution. So that being said, you can find images all day that wouldn't make a difference to be in a high resolution space. And if you're covering an image with color plates as well, it also, the difference between 1,200 pixels per inch and 2,400 pixels per inch, when you've got a bunch of color on top of it, I mean, is negligible or zero.
I'll point out this for something for, again, people who want to use this in their work to keep in mind. Inking has become optional in a lot of comics,
Right.
Whether you're drawing digitally, whether you're painting, whether you're reproducing pencil, which we can talk about reproducing pencil too. But if you are inking at this point, it's almost this, I hate to use the word fetish, but it is sort of a very specific detail and look and style that you're going for. And so that's why you would want to reproduce that at the highest fidelity possible, because you're really you're making a creative choice whenever you're choosing to do, ink lines. And so that's why you would want this, because it's a big part of the style that you're choosing to employ in your art. So you want to reproduce that obviously as well as possible, and that's specifically where what you're describing would really be applied.
Yeah, and I truly believe that there's a more visceral reaction we have to line art. I think it gives us some kind of immediate response, and not to be too esoteric, but you're I suppose
Too late for that.
Yeah. Your vision systems for black and white seeing are completely different than your vision systems for color seeing, and your
from an evolutionary standpoint, we developed the black and white vision far earlier than we developed the color system. So it's a much older system within our vision system.
Right, and Carson refers to it as edge detection, and basically you imagine what a moth has to be able to see in order to avoid getting eaten by a bird, and you sort of picture why it is that we want to have a immediate reaction to certain kinds of visual stimuli. And I really think I truly do believe that we read an image in a way that we almost never read a color image. It's a different kind of experience.
I've never considered that at all, but you think about reading text on paper and it's almost always black on white, line essentially. Yeah. It's interesting to think about like a line art as a piece that you read.
And it can be deeply unsettling to sit down to a novel and find it like in orange or something. I mean, it's not the same experience to read text that's in color. I mean, I don't know exactly, I'd be curious to see if this is a researchable thing, but or we're a bunch of fetishists who love our 200-year-old pens.
Right.
Which I do. So, guilty as charged. Yeah. So basically, I here I'm trying to describe a process that I can show you. So maybe I should try to just pull back just a little bit and say that when you're reproducing for color, your goals are very different. And working in color, your resolution space never needs to be higher than 600 pixels per inch. This is another thing, by the way, that you will hear pushback from the printer. The printers will oftentimes assert that 400 pixels per inch or 450 pixels per inch is good enough for grayscale or color files. And that is undoubtedly true if you're talking about soft images, images that don't have a lot of what I'm calling high frequency information. But when we look at something like your ballpoint pen drawings in a minute here, those are covered with high frequency information. And that extra bit of resolution helps those high frequency aspects get through the screening process. And so basically, you want to help that along as much as you can. And so keeping it in the high resolution space and then doing a bunch of sharpening, those are the things that help those high frequency aspects push through the screening process. So two totally different things, but they behave. The principles are fairly simple to understand, and what it kind of falls down on is when you're looking at something that has been inappropriately scanned, or it comes to you in a way that's just totally you don't know what to do with it at all. Like that's when having done this now for 7 years really benefits, where I can problem solve in a fairly quick amount of time. I mean, I feel like I could teach somebody the basics of like how to do something in the best possible way, in an hour or two. But teaching somebody how to troubleshoot every possible thing, especially when you're dealing with archival materials, that's a whole other subject.
Should we dive into an example? Do you want to, walk us through some of these points?
Let me get this started here. All right. Can you see my screen now?
I can. Yeah. Excellent.
Great. So Jim, this scan right here is a great example of what we were talking about before. So this is done with ballpoint pen, is that right?
That's right.
Fantastic drawing, by the way.
Thank you.
So this is a great example of what we were talking about in terms of color reproduction and where it really matters what the resolution is. So this needs to be reproduced in color because obviously you're not just getting you're getting a lot of contrast between your lines here in terms of your actual handling, right? I mean, that's the point of drawing it with a ballpoint pen. It's more like a pencil or a silver point as opposed to a pen, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I never think about it that way, but that's absolutely right.
So you've got this feathering here in the back that's pushing that much lighter than the hatching over here. And it's not just because you're using a thinner or a thicker line. It's because you've got a value change there too. You've got these being actually lighter than this. And so because of that, we're going to need to reproduce this as a color image. So that's where the color resolution really matters. And if you look, your scan right here, this is optically sharp, what's called optically sharp, in that your scanner has captured it very well, but it is not sharp enough to look sharp in print. And so we're actually going to use an external solution on this. The resolution looks like it's fine to me, but let's go ahead and check it. So are you going to reproduce this at size?
That's my plan.
Great. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt-I to bring up the size dialog in Photoshop. And we're going to view this in terms of inches and resolution. So you've got this at 600 pixels per inch at the actual size that you drew it at. So that is going to be great. So this is going to be exactly what we're going to use for our final image. And is it okay with you if I go ahead and flatten this frame that you've made here?
Yes, for sure.
So I'm going to flatten this. I'm going to merge these layers. And let's go ahead and duplicate this layer too. And we're going to name this sharpened. And just for the sake of this, as a demonstration, so we can easily turn on and off and see what it is that we've actually done. And so I'm going to get right up in here and really take a look. And first off, I'm gonna make a little adjustment here because I see that you got a hair.
Hey, I saw that when you zoomed in
your scan. So using the clone stamp tool, make a little adjustment here. So really getting up in here, I'm going to give it a first layer of sharpening. And what I'm going to use, I'm going to go to Filter, Sharpen. This is what's called Unsharp Mask. This is the crudest possible way you can do this. And this is actually, believe it or not, this was a process that was available in the darkroom in the past, in a pre-digital age. And what they would do is they would make a blurry version of a certain image, and they would overlay the blurry version with the image they want to sharpen. And that result would, outputting that result would actually sharpen up the edges. So what this essentially is like a contrast adjustment for the edges. You have 3 different controls for this tool here. This is an amazing tool. This is a tool that I use every single day. Unsharp Mask. This is the dumbest possible version of this tool. Adobe makes, a dozen more, and they're all ridiculous. You don't need any of them. This is the only one that you need. It's got 3 controls. Okay. Amount. This is basically how much contrast adjustment are we doing? Okay. If I put it up to 500, you start to see some ridiculous artifacts here. That's because this is already an optically sharp image. In other words, your scanner is good. You've got a good scanner. Your capture is good, right? That's the thing that matters the most. So because you have a normal capture, this amount does not need to be particularly high. Okay. Radius is how wide is this effect. You see, if I make the radius like 100 pixels, you got some really crazy things happening. Basically, you start to fill in. And it's not just filling in the lines, you're filling in the gaps as well. So this radius, unless you're looking for a particular kind of effect or you have a very blurry image, the radius control is not something that you really need to keep very high on a regular basis. And then the last control is the threshold. The threshold is basically like, how much does it grab? So the lower that we make our threshold, if I put it all the way down, it's basically grabbing everything. If I put the threshold to 0, it's going to grab everything. It's even going to grab noise in the paper and things like that. That's actually not a desirable thing. This first thing that we're going to do here is basically I'm going to keep the threshold fairly low, but not to 0. And 0, you really start to get some weird artifacts because it starts grabbing like the JPEG compression if you saved it as a JPEG and things like that. So I'm going to keep this threshold, 12 looks pretty good to me. And I'm keeping the radius fairly low here because basically what I'm doing right now is I'm just basically trying to bring out the texture of what you've drawn. This is just an attempt to basically, we're going to try to get some of this high frequency information through the print process. So I'm going to turn it on and off here. Hopefully you can see that. I'll zoom in even more in case people are watching on a low resolution device. Keep in mind, I'm working on a 4K monitor right here that I've calibrated. I've color calibrated the monitor. I color calibrate my scanner so that I'm inputting exactly, as accurate to the color as I can. All those are different topics, by the way, but so this looks pretty good to me. I've got a low threshold, I've got a low radius, and my amount is fairly low too, about 150%. And so this is just a first pass. The idea of this is that we've just brought out some of the texture here. You can get fairly extreme with that, but there's no need to. Like I said, this is a good scan. And now the second pass that we're going to do here is going to be to exaggerate some of the larger areas of contrast. And actually, we might have been able to do that a little higher. Maybe I'll do one more pass at the same settings, but just a slightly lower amount. Because I think that looks a little better now that I'm zoomed out. I'm paying attention to my percentage. I'm at 100% right now. So actually, this might be a little heavy. Okay, so let's do one more pass. And I'm going to change the settings this time. I'm going to raise the radius to something more along the lines of like 4 or 5 pixels. And I'm going to bring the threshold down. So now it's only really accentuating the areas that have higher contrast. Basically, it's grabbing less now. Since I've moved this threshold up, we're grabbing less. So this is basically like to ensure that the highest areas of contrast have a lot of punch to them. You think about this as like your punch. This is like those highest areas are really getting it. Okay, and that looks pretty good to me. I could try boosting the amount a little bit. Yeah, that's decent right there. Okay, so the amount is actually less than before. It's affecting less. And that, my friend, is ready for print. The only real question I would have about an image like this beyond here is how much of the paper you want to knock out. But since you've intentionally drawn this, go back to intention already, you've intentionally drawn this on, where we can see what the object is. You've incorporated the object into your composition. You've got these lines going straight through it. I mean, obviously, we're not going to knock out all those. So basically, to me, knocking out the paper in this situation is less important. But just for the hell of it, let's go ahead and make a new adjustment layer. I'm going to go to New Adjustment Layer, Curves. I'm going to do this as an adjustment layer just so that you can turn it on and off easily without damaging the image. It's not applying this. It's just applying this in real time. So now that actually looks a heck of a lot better to me. So what I've done up in the curves here is this, you can see this spike here, Jim?
Yes.
This spike is where your information is. You see how it falls off from that peak? Mm-hmm. All of this is unused bandwidth. This is basically like telling me that the highlights of your image are all over here instead. So if I bring it way up, you start to get that white of the paper. I bring it too far up, you start to blow out your high frequency information. So there's a trade-off right here with this particular thing. At least working for an image that's going to be half-toned, there's a trade-off. We'll talk about it with the line art, but there's not the same trade-off with line art because you can just sharpen the bejesus out of it until you get everything in there. But because these have a different value than these other lines, that's not really a possibility for us. We're not going to reproduce that as line art. And so how does, at least, you're not on the same monitor as me, but how are you seeing this image right now?
So the sharpness is something that I have not typically done. it's funny because I used to do that with like adjusting photos for
Hmm.
print. But it's not something that I do on my scan work. So that's interesting to bring that back in. One thing I tend to do, and probably more in line art, but I do it a little bit on these ballpoint pen and color pieces, is I adjust levels.
Okay.
And it feels similar to what I'm seeing with the curves.
Right.
Usually even the information, like whenever you look at that curve graph and you say like to the right there, that gray spike kind of falls off and you have a little bit of unused information or whatever
Right.
there. I feel like when you look at like levels adjustment,
Yep.
there's often a similar thing.
There is 100%. So this curve right here, or sorry, the graph right here is the same as the one that you would see if I brought up the levels command. The reason I've let off levels is a lot easier to understand, and I think that is what I'd use for most of the time. The reason I stopped doing levels is because Photoshop has a glitch in it where it doesn't record levels all the time for scripts. And so if you look over here, for instance, I have some scripts going. You can see that I got Cerebus Actions 2021, Cerebus Archive Scans, Gerhard Sharpened Scans, correction or whatever. I do scripts for everything. And so because Photoshop has a glitch currently involving levels, I'm just doing this on curves instead.
Okay.
But
it makes me
basically
feel better, actually.
No,
like,
it's great.
man, am I behind here?
No. It's basically the same thing. So on the levels, grabbing this over here on the left is the same as using the white knob on the levels. Grabbing this on the right, the black one, is the same as using the black one on the levels. And then this is your mids control from the levels. But the thing is with the curve is that you can affect it in different ways. So basically, like if you were just grabbing the mid slider and moving it, this is the same.
Yes.
But this gives you a graphic representation of what's happening when you do that. So if
Yeah,
you look,
I imagine it would also allow you to grab it rather than just, like levels or your midpoint and your white and black. This
right.
would allow you to be more nuanced. Like it looks like there, you're grabbing 25% in, or
you got it
roughly. So
and
that's
I'm
kind of
bringing
nice.
and bringing that up and bringing the other one down does all types of crazy things to your image. You can start to see inside of the shadowed areas. You rarely want to make these kind of extreme adjustments on something unless something has been really messed up on the way in. The way to think about this stuff from an audio perspective, that's what's called signal path. And basically, the further you get down the chain, the less desirable it is to make changes there. And the signal path thing applies to an artist as well. If you're making art on paper, obviously the very best thing you can do is correct something on paper. And then the next most important thing after the actual art that you made is the scanning. And while you can correct things after the fact with the scan, and with these types of adjustments, these are painless. These are not things that you need to correct at the scan. It's always better to do it if you can, at the previous step. Anyway, this is basically like a fancy pants, levels correction.
Yeah, greater control, which I love as a micromanager. It's my obsessive personality.
Well, that's interesting as a micromanager that you do ballpoint pen drawings over blue lines. So you're giving up a certain part of the process at the beginning.
A little bit, but I think the notebook paper does add something to it.
Oh yeah,
because I've shown these, and you'll see people react. Like everybody, we're probably losing it in terms of generations now. But everybody of say 40 years or older, like we were all traumatized staring at notebooks and doodling in our notebooks. And I think the notebook brings a lot of value to it. The other thing that I found interesting when I started doing these ballpoint pen drawings, I experimented with all types of paper, very good paper, and I found that the paper that had like maybe the better paper with more fiber, terrible with the ballpoint pens. Like the ballpoints would get clogged up, and this paper actually worked really well. Photocopy printer paper I find works equally well. But I like the notebook part, so there are some trade-offs. Sometimes I think about drawing it on the lineless paper, and then I can always add the lines, but that feels a little bit like cheating to me.
Right.
So,
well, you're exaggerating the objectness of it. You're inviting someone to see this as an art object as opposed to a amorphous thing. I think that as we enter the digital age, or we've been in the digital age for a while, but the objectness of something takes on a different kind of poignancy to it.
Yeah, I was going to say that earlier whenever you were talking about just books in general not being produced well. And
Right.
like I have that opinion of we can do this stuff digitally, so share it digitally. But if you're going to make the print object, if you're going to make the book, figure out how to make the best you can in print. And that's the thing that I see people drop the ball with. This is a little bit extreme version of that because my plan is to reproduce a notebook.
Right.
But just from a practical standpoint, like if you're going to bother to translate this into a printed book of any sort, you want to maximize that stuff. Whatever qualities come with print, you want to certainly incorporate those.
Right. And if you were my client who was coming to me and asking me how to do this particular project, the thing that I would very much encourage you to do is to make sure that all of your scans are in the same state. And the reason for that is because if you were happy with the adjustments that we just made, all of those things are scriptable.
Right.
So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to click create a new action, and I'm going to call this Jim Rugg Notebook Scan. And we could go back through. I'm going to stop the recording right here. Stop the action recording. We could go back through each of those stages and redo each of them while recording that action. And then you could batch process all of these. So, you go through and you scan 200 of these, and then you run that batch, and you're still going to want to go in and do some amount of manual editing, most likely, like if you have a bunch of hair on his nose.
Right.
In your scan. Obviously the computer, script is not going to go through and eliminate that for you. But that the majority of that work is then done for you. So
Yes.
Setting up a script for yourself, that is the way to do it. And actually that's the way that I've done. You were asking about other people. Some of the people that I've done freelance work for, I've just written them a script. They sent me a scan and I say, okay, tweak this and tweak that. They tweak this and they tweak that. They send me another scan and I say, okay, these are your settings. You were locked into this setting. Here's your script. And then they output the whole thing. And, they get to the last stage and then they export their PDF and they send it to me before they send it to their printer. And I say, you messed up your settings on the PDF and everything is reduced to 72 pixels per inch screen.
I shouldn't laugh, but
that might be an hour's worth of work for me. But the difference between the two projects is, night and day. To have someone, and as cartoonists, you can be very. It can be tempting to just kind of go it alone. But like when it comes to this type of stuff, I don't know if everybody should learn every aspect of this type of process stuff because it frankly can drive you nuts. I think that there's something to be said for drawing it in your notebook and then, having a trusted person come and scan it or whatever, go through the process. Maybe you like the micromanaging everything, or maybe you trust somebody to do that part for you. So, but
trust
anyway,
is a good word for that too. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe it's trust issues that I'm dealing with, not just micromanagement and OCD.
Well, let's go ahead and take a look at the AB. I'm going to group these so we can turn it off easily. So here's the before and here's the after. And we are on my monitor, we're at 100% right now, which, in fairly far.
It is interesting. I often say one of the places where I would see weird digital to print issues was that often the print would look much darker than it looks on a monitor. And I would kind of train myself almost like one of these batch processes or one of these actions that I would record where it was like, I know what it looks like on screen and what it looks like in print. Mm-hmm. And I would describe it to friends of mine who were trying to do this as like, you sort of want it will look wrong on screen, essentially. Otherwise, it will look darker in print. And it's a weird notion. Like you almost need the reps and seeing it printed to have the confidence that this thing I'm looking at on screen is not quite what I want it to be. And I say that because when I look at this adjusted image, that unsharpened, the level of unsharpness in like the pen strokes, it's a little bit off to me. You know what I mean? Like in my head,
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay. You know what you're doing here. I would trust you. I would defer to you and your experience that this is going to print properly.
The the
I would also
sharpened the
need
sharpened one looks wrong to you.
the unsharp looks very almost crisp.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so I'm
and
not
part
used to
of
looking at that. And it's interesting for me to see that because I trust that would print right. But to my eye, it's like,
what
okay,
you're also seeing right now, you're not seeing my screen capture.
that's true.
You're seeing me through the zoom filter and all the zoom encoding and everything like that.
Very true.
It's interesting though. I did a bunch of one-off tests with this stuff where, and this is something that you can test for yourself, Jim. Basically, if you can go to a local copy store that has one of those very large color Xerox uh, assemblies that has can print 11 by 17 on coated paper, specifically ask for coated paper and do some tests there. The output of those machines is comparable in sharpness to an offset process.
That is
And
fantastic to hear. I was going to ask you about that because some of the materials that brought me to you, I assume they were printed in small
yeah,
quantities, and I wondered if they were all offset, if some of them were digitally printed.
yep, the everything except for Strange Death, those little books that we sent that are in color are all done digitally.
That
And
blows my mind. I wouldn't have
and
thought that in a million years.
not only were they done digitally, they were done by the cheapest printer in North America.
You want to give them a plug?
I do. Printing Center USA does a fantastic job with color stuff. Absolutely fantastic job. It's insane to me that people are not using them right and left. Any cartoonist that does small quantity color work should be working with them. Um,
This
uh,
sounds revolutionary, to be very honest with you, because I do zines, I do small quantities. And whenever the quality is subpar, I assume, well, that's a limitation of, the color laser printer or whatever they're using. It's probably a limitation on my preparation of the files.
it's very possible. Yeah. And the thing about this stuff, the sharpening stuff really seems like voodoo until you actually go through and really do an analysis of the result. And so when we had one of these Cerebus Kickstarters to raise money for the thing, I just went down to the copy shop and I just drove them nuts. I was like, okay, here, print all 12 of these. I'm going to look at all these. And I went through and actually scanned in the results of the printing. So I took these printed results and scanned them back in and looked at the image after it had been through the halftone. And that's when I started arriving at the conclusion of on a 4K monitor really up close, you want to make it look crispy. And the reason is because it has to survive the process of being filtered through those 4 different color planes happening simultaneously. You have to give, especially images with this high frequency information, you have to make those things have enough contrast so that when your eye is getting fooled by those 4 color overlays, it gets through. And actually looking at those one-on-one was a real revelation for me when I realized, oh, this thing looks crispy. And then I bring up it doesn't look that way at all in print. And then I bring it up the scan of it and I look at it side by side and it's like, you can't see any of that crispiness because of course it's being filtered through 4 different layers of dots.
Yeah, and back to your printers who say that the human eye can't see X or Y, like we
Yeah.
probably can't see the level of 2400 pixels per inch, whatever that prints out to, whatever their resolution is on the printing device. Like, can we see 400 or 600 dots per inch?
Yeah.
It does, I'm sure, blur together to some extent. It's a neat idea about the scanning them. Whenever I had done Aphrodisiac, which was really about like old comic book printing processes. Well, that's not what it was about, but I mean, that was a big part of what it was about to me. I learned so much because I would scan old comic books at mega resolution and I would be
Right.
looking at them, where a square inch of the book or of the scan would fill up my screen so that I could really see like, how is that ink bleeding? What is the texture on that page? And it was like a whole different world looking at it that way. So it makes sense to do that with prints.
Right, and you get right up in there and compare the results, and it's quite extraordinary. Um,
That's fascinating. I have
so
another question. I don't know if this is the time to ask it, but since we're here,
yeah, no.
one thing I struggle with is reproducing the blue that you see there in like a
Mhm.
CMYK process. Um, any thoughts on that? If you were going to send this to your printer, would you
Uh-huh.
send it as an RGB file or as a CMYK file?
That's a good question. If you are worried about it, the best thing you can do is do the conversion yourself. If it's something where you have been dissatisfied with that particular thing in the past, you should do the conversion yourself. And once again, this is something that's scriptable. You can just add this to the back end of your thing. You can even have this as a script that runs afterwards. But basically, if you go to let's see, where is this? This is in Edit, uh, Convert to Profile. Okay, and if you take a look at this, Adobe enables you to convert to, we're going to use working CMYK swap version 2. And it gives you a several different options as far as how to do the conversion. And what you might find is that there's a certain version of this that gives you a much better result. So the relative color metric in my eye is keeping some of the intensity here. But it's also possible that you've got a sort of purplish hue to it. So it might be that you really are getting some kind of, either your pen itself is not really hewing very close to the blue spectrum, or your scanner itself needs to be set up and calibrated. There's a guy in Germany who sells $25 color scanner calibrators. And it's basically a test sheet that you can use. If you have a professional scanning software, I would really highly recommend ViewScan. You can do calibration inside of the program and make sure that your scan really is, coming across in the way that you want it to. But yeah, when I'm looking at this right now, relative color metric looks like the best, like in the box solution, but it does have a pretty high dip, or a pretty steep dip in terms of your color intensity, which would suggest to me that this is not a true blue, that we've got some kind of color mix happening here that's not been. Yeah, this looks like a purple to me when I'm just sampling a little bit. We've got 100% cyan, 100% magenta, and then a fair bit of yellow and black in those dark areas anyway. So I would take a look at your color calibration, and it's possible that you might tweak this a little bit if you want to give it like a real true blue intensity. Purple is still a place where color tends to fall off in color reproduction, for color reproduction. And so anytime you have an issue like that, you should consider doing the color conversion yourself. And I should say too, Carson and I have been talking about different things to do. Carson and I have a YouTube channel. We've been doing mostly book reviews from a fairly nerdy perspective, in terms of like, we'll flip through and then we'll talk about reproduction. We'll talk about how the eye works. We'll talk about line art. We'll talk about like, oh, how did they do this? Literally we end up like trying to draw with chopsticks in order to emulate a certain kind of line that somebody did, or we pull out the razor blades and try to figure out, is this a razor blade line? How did they do that? Dissect things. And we've been talking about different ways, and we've been talking about doing like a Patreon or something like that, where we could get into different things that people are interested in. So if people are like really into the reproduction stuff, and they think that this is a topic that they would like to learn more about, that's one of the things we're considering doing when we launch a Patreon.
What is the name of your podcast, of your YouTube channel?
Living the Line. And we're sort of trying out different things right now. It feels like casting off in different directions. But this type of topic, if this is something that people are really into, you can let us know. And when we launch our Patreon, hopefully fairly soon, this is something that we might include in there. Carson's a college professor who does drawing lessons and things like that, and so that's another resource that we've considered. We've considered making it a sort of cartoonist boot camp type thing, where like you could take a project all the way from the nuts to soup, as it were. But anyway, this is one of these little things. Like, it's funny, I didn't even, consider talking about that. But as soon as you asked me, of course, that's something that you want to think about. That's where my brain is going right now. It's just like there are literally hundreds of these type of things that have come up, in the past 7 years of doing this stuff, that I'm happy to share the knowledge of. It's just a matter of trying to figure out a way that I could have enough time to do it. I'm sorry to derail us again.
No, this is great. There's so much information that you're giving out here. Like, I'm taking notes, and some of the stuff I'm just defaulting to, I will have this video as a reference. So it's good to know, like, everybody's at different levels of this stuff, but the idea of, years ago, I visited Tom Kaczynski, who publishes Uncivilized Books, and I was a fan at the time. He was doing mostly mini comics, and I visited his studio production space, and I was shocked because, like, the equipment, I looked around and it was essentially what I had in my cube at my old design job, the long arm paper cutter and, relatively basic stuff, a black and white laser printer. And yet he was making these mini comics that to me were some of the best looking mini comics I had seen. And whenever I saw what tools he was using, it was like, oh, I have no excuse, because this is, it's stuff that we all have. Like, my scanner is the cheapest 11x17 scanner I could find. So if you look at this and think scan wise, this is fine.
Yep.
That's awesome, because, I used to have an Epson 10,000 XL that I bought used, and it was great. But I mean, what are those, like $5,000 or something new? They're very expensive.
Yeah.
The scanner that I scanned this Abdullah the Butcher drawing was like $200. So the idea that you could get by with this, relatively affordable equipment is amazing. So, everybody that's watching this and thinking, how do they make their work look better? I think we're all at different stages of what we know to do, what we've done. But you've laid out like just a lot of information that I think is probably going to apply to everybody a little bit differently, depending on where they're at and what they're making. And I appreciate that a lot.
Well, one thing I will say is the difference between your $200 scanner and the Epson, which, by the way, that is the very best scanner that's on the market. The Epson, I think it's like a 12,000 XL now is the new number, but it's essentially optically exactly the same as the 10,000 XL, which is what I have in my closet over here. That's what I use. The difference between those is that the scanning element is very different, and your workforce, Epson workforce, has a very narrow focal length. So if you look at, do you see the spiral here?
Yes.
It basically spirals into blurriness. If you have any amount of lift whatsoever on your scanner, you're going to have a blurry image. And in fact, it's not a problem. This is actually looks great to me, and it enhances the objectness. But if you look at this little area right here, you'll see that you have a divot in the paper. You've got an ink buildup that has caused a little bit of moisture on there, and it's actually divoted into blurriness right there. I think that enhances the look of this in this particular case, because the objectness is so important to the, what you're doing. And this is a very cool look to it. But that scanner element has basically a focal length of approximately, 2 millimeters or something like that. As soon as something lifts off the page at all, you start having issues. And so that's the more expensive Epson series has a much wider focal length, and so you can do object scanning. If you have a certain amount of lift, it's not really an issue. If you do paste up or something like that, you're not going to have any issues or things like that. But as far as the fidelity goes, everything that's being made right now should be reasonable. There are exceptions. There are exceptions, but yeah, and price shouldn't be a issue right now. Should we take a look at something else, or are we?
Yeah, if you have time, like maybe we could look at Red Room 4 scan, and like questions I have here. One, you can talk to us about prepping line art.
Yeah.
But the other piece would be original art, right? Like, a lot of us are into artist editions, and like one thing that Ed and I have talked about is doing a print series of these, like the original art from these alternative covers that I did for Red Room.
Right.
And man, your print on demand story from a minute ago makes me very eager to try that now. But I wonder if you could talk to us about those two things. So prepping line art, and then also maybe how you would approach original art scans, like as an artist edition?
So first off, if you are trying to, the first thing I would say is that keep all your stages of everything. And keep them separated from each other. So when I'm doing the Cerebus project, I get all the original art scans, and I have everything for a certain book in a folder that is labeled original art scans and then has the source. And then if I get scans from Gerhard for the pages that he has, I save those in a separate place. You always got to keep these things separated. And my logic for this is, if somewhere down the road Dave wants to do a full-size color reproduction of an entire book or something like that, why should he have to scan all those things again? He's already scanned them in color. By the way, scanning in grayscale doesn't exist. If you ask your scanner to scan in grayscale, all it does is scans in color and then throws out 2 of the sensors randomly. You never want to scan in grayscale because there's no point to it. You don't want to randomly throw out the colors. You want to have control over where that color goes and which channel is being used. In some cases, the color channels on a scanner even have different sharpnesses. The blue ones are notoriously bad, noisier sensors than the other 2. I don't know what the deal is with that. I'm not an engineer, but it's true. So anyway, keep all these things separate. So for instance, if you've got a series, all of your Red Room covers have all been scanned, put them in a folder, color Red Room. And then when you are making a script for this, we'll go ahead and do this as a script so we can see it. So we'll call this Red Room color to bitmap, or color to cleanup, let's call it, because we're not actually going to make a bitmap file. So when I'm looking at this scan looks good to me. I'm going to go in. Okay, so I see that you printed it out in some type of blue line process. I can see that your blue line process was not just with the blue of your printer. So perhaps something to tweak in the future, just to make it easier to eliminate it and not have any noise. And I can see that you see this softness here.
Yes.
So this softness is because the resolution that you've scanned this at, this is butting up against the resolution of your scan. So this means that you're going to need more sharpness, more sharpening in order to retain all of those details at the final stage. So this is butting up against the resolution space that we're in right now. So let's take a look at what the resolution space is. I'm going to hit Control-Alt-I, and I'm going to bring this up. So I see that your resolution is 450 pixels per inch, and it looks like your original was drawn on 11 by 17 paper, probably a 10 by 5, or 10 by 15 active image area, something like that.
That sounds all right.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate as much of that blue as I can. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to make a script here for it. So I've got my script turned on down here. It says Red Room color to cleanup. And I'm going to go image, adjustments, black and white. This black and white filter enables you to grab color bands and adjust the darkness or lightness of those color bands individually. So in this case, by taking the cyan and the blue color bands, it looks like and pushing them up, it gets rid of most of what you had right there. There's a little bit left over, which means that you weren't printing 100% blue, but that's okay. We might have a little bit of noise to clean up, but it doesn't look like that. It looks pretty good right now. So now you can see that it added it to our script here. So we've got black and white. And you can break that down if you want to see what the actual control was. So now, as long as you are scanning everything with the same settings, you could just run a script, once we're done with our script. So we're going to bring this into a higher resolution space. Did you say this was reproduced in color, right? With color on top of it?
Yes.
So we're not going to go overkill here. We're going to bring this into 1,200 pixels per inch, unless you want to go full bore.
No, that's good. That's good.
Okay. So actually, hold on. I got to convert the mode first. So I go image mode, grayscale. I'm going to discard my color information. And then I'm going to hit Alt Control I again. And I'm going to change this top part to percentage. And I'm going to reduce it to 60%, which is probably approximately what the reduction was to imprint. You know, you can do this to whatever percentage it is that you're going to do. And then after you have that, you're going to go to resolution, and I'm going to change that to 1,200 pixels per inch. And we get a little preview of what that's going to look like. Now, because you didn't use any screen tone in your image, I'm going to use as mode, I'm going to use preserve details. This is a very, very, very esoteric thing. Basically, if you're doing line art, bicubic is usually best, especially if you're going to have any screen tone or anything like that, mechanical tone. If you're using color, preserve details is going to be best. In this case, since you don't have any screen tone on your image, and I don't know if you ever use screen tone, we'll just go ahead and use preserve details.
I use screen tone.
Oh, you do?
Okay. Once in a while.
So we'd use bicubic then. And then it resizes it. So now our resolution space is that higher resolution. So if you look now, our size is 7 by 10, and our resolution is 1,200 pixels per inch. But our job is not done because all of this softness is not going to translate to a sharp bitmap. So let's make a copy and duplicate this layer here. We'll call this sharpened. I'll make a new layer here. We'll call this cleanup.
I'm so embarrassed. We're zoomed in on my signature, which was one of my mistakes. You see the 22. Yeah. I corrected that after the fact. That's no great. Idea where my mind was at the time.
You were just hoping that this year would be over. And we're going to go to layer, new adjustment layer, threshold. This is what's going to convert our image to line art. We can turn this on and off to get a preview. And if you look, you can see certain areas of your line art are just disappearing when we do the threshold conversion. Those areas are not sufficiently sharp or don't present sufficient enough contrast to survive the bitmap making process. So let's zoom right in on there, and we can watch the lines disappear. You also notice that all that stuff in the black goes right away, okay? Don't futz with your blacks. You almost never have to clean up black unless there's a big problem for some reason. This is just a thing that people like to, their brains like to fill it in, like you're coloring by numbers. It's a total waste of time. There's almost never a need to do that. So anyway, I'm going to turn off the threshold, and I'm going to click on my sharpen layer. You can see that our script just added all of those things.
Right.
So I'm going to stop the script for a second. I'm going to delete all that except for the first one, hide current layer. That just turns off our threshold. And then I'm going to restart our script. And I'm going to go to filter, sharpen, unsharp mask. And like I said before, even though this is called unsharp mask, that just has to do with how it was originally produced. It's sharpening is all this is. That just happens to be what the name of the tool is. If you're talking about this process, you call it sharpening. What I'm looking for is a setting that is going to spike the sharpness of our line art there. So I'm going to make the amount go up fairly high. And look at that. All of a sudden, those are nice and sharp and black. And the radius that I have is fairly low right here. And the threshold is actually fairly low too. And basically, what you want to get right here when it comes to line art is basically, can you make the lines sharper without bringing up too much noise in the black areas? That's the trade-off that you've got here. And not just noise. In the case here, I can actually see a white line forming where you worked that edge with a different tool. I don't know if it's because you drew a portion of that with I'm not sure exactly what, but that looks pretty good to me. My radius is fairly low. I like to keep the radius on something like this somewhere between 1 and 1.5 pixels. Depending on how blurry something is, you might need to go higher than that, but this looks actually pretty good. So let's take a look at that. And we're going to test this out by turning on our threshold. And now you see all of your lines are preserved. So let's go ahead and, depending on how detailed you've gotten here, you can see that we've got a little bit of sort of noisy stuff from that blue line process. And it doesn't look like that's surviving the threshold. So actually, this is probably just fine. If you had gone finer in here, we would add a couple other steps. What we would do is bring up a curves control. Like I said before, very similar to levels, but Photoshop is busted when it comes to levels currently. And I'm going to knock out a little bit of paper here with my curves control. And I'm going to bring up the black point just a little, just a hair. And you can see those things. You can see the spike. This is all of the unused bandwidth on the top here. I'm going to knock out just a little bit of more of the paper. I'm going to do that one more time. And then I'm going to add one more layer of mild sharpening. Oop, and I just accidentally added the same level of sharpening we did before, but not my intention. My computer is running a little slow because I've got Zoom going. This is giving me like a little lag for some reason. But basically, this is the same sort of two-stage sharpening that we did with the color image. And I'm just going to get just the teeniest bit here, and this will just make sure that we're reinforcing all of the sharpest areas. Now, if you look, it's not just the lines that are getting sharpened. It's your shadow areas. I'm going to turn this on and off so you can see what I mean. So all of the hatching that you did in here in these dense areas is now showing up. Now, the thing is, somebody might be saying right now, oh, well, that's all going to fill in when it's printed anyway. Well, all these things are incremental improvements that you can make. Each of these things are like chipping away at the problem. And, you know, the more trusted a printer that you have, the better paper that you're printing on, the better those things are going to be preserved. And they can't be preserved at all if you didn't preserve them in the first place, if you didn't deliver them to them. So this is basically a finished image. This is ready for export. So at this point, I would save and close this. And the reason for that is because anytime you can batch something, you should be batching something. So after I've saved and closed this thing, or I've cleaned up, you know, the outside areas. So like, you know, we could do a quick cleanup right now and use the marquee tool. But see that this is all pre-script. So I would basically run this script on every page for your book and then go in and do cleanup as a separate stage so that you don't ever have to be sitting, watching, waiting for a computer to do something. Let's just do like a little A-B here. I'm going to zoom in on an area of high detail, hit the threshold, and we can just see what the difference is that our sharpening process made. And the other thing that this difference that we made here is that we brought our image into a high resolution space, a much higher resolution space than it was previously. And so each of these lines on the curve has more information to look like a smoother kind of curve. And you can imagine when you start to see something up close like this, you can imagine why that resolution really matters. So for instance, if we were to make this in 2,400 pixels per inch, you would have 4 times as many of these pixels here. And, you know, resolution doesn't matter until it does. If you've got a 1 pixel line, as in it's, you know, 1 pixel across, and it's going straight up and down, that might survive a low resolution space because that straight up and down is along the dimension that the sampling is happening. If you have a line that's a curve, that's going to look horrible in a low resolution space because that's going to be made up of stair steps. It's going to be made up of crude blocks. If you have a line that's just barely off the straight, that's just going to look absolutely terrible in a low resolution space. So all of these things are sort of edge cases here. The finer that you work, the more that resolution matters.
Right.
The more black and white something, the more that resolution matters. So anyway, the last stage after you've done all your cleanup, you've scripted everything and made them all like this, would be to mode, convert to bitmap. And that should be the actual thing that you are delivering to the printer, is this 1-bit image. Now, Photoshop does artists no favors by making 1-bit images look pretty horrid in Photoshop until you've actually done the conversion. Somebody at Adobe must hate line art because they've got things set up so that you can just mess this up so many different ways. All of the default PDF export settings are set so that line art is converted to absolutely horrid resolution. You have to manually change that every time that you open a new Adobe product for the first time. If you don't know what you're doing, you end up with this mess of pixels every time you export something. And anyway, this is going to look faithful to your drawing board. And if it were going to be reproduced in black and white, and you'd use really, really, really ultra fine lines, that extra bit of resolution you could get from doing it in 2,400 pixels per inch would be better.
Wow. I feel like I thought I knew what I was doing coming into this conversation. And there are quite a few things that I can improve on. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, there's no end to the amount of these types of things that you can actually, learn. I mean, I was mentioning bitmap images, or sorry, I was mentioning negatives earlier. I mean, you really want to blow your mind. Let's take a peek at, let's see, I think I have some negative images for the last day, the last Cerebus book. Here's some negative scans that just came in for this book. I'm just going to open a random page here. So we got negative scans for pages that we don't have original artwork for. Let's take a look at this, what it actually looks like in person. So this is what it looks like in person. It's a reverse image of the actual thing. If you zoom in, it looks relatively on-off, but there's actually hidden information in here. Let's take a look at this dot tone up close. I'm going to convert it back to where it was. So let's use our curves command. Now, even getting a good scan of a negative, this took weeks of work trying to figure out the optimal way to scan these so that they would actually be able to do what we needed them to do. But let's take a look at what happens when you grab a curves control with this. All of a sudden, you're seeing all of this hidden information, and some of it is just dirt and stuff on the schmutz on the negative that'll have to be cleaned out. But if you pull that all the way away, you'll see that it's not just affecting, this is a really good scan of a negative, it's not just affecting the darkness and lightness of the black areas, it's actually literally affecting the density of the tone and the size of the fine lines. So we were talking about copy dot scans before and how all these publishers have thrown out their physical objects. Well, I could take this tone and turn this thing that was basically going to reproduce too dark into a thing that's going to reproduce perfectly. This page in particular is going to look almost indistinguishable from the original artwork because it was photocopied really well. The only way it's going to look like that, though, is if it's handled correctly by somebody after it's been scanned. And that handling, this is a little light. We went a little light here, but you can see basically like what I mean by that, just by toggling back and forth. Essentially, like you can do a density control to the scan negative. In other words, the negative is not like a bitmap. The negative is like those grayscale files that I'm saving from the original artwork, where you have a certain amount of play in them, and you can change that density very easily. And if you know things about the product and the artwork and the original artwork, you can, there's an awful lot of play in there. So, publishers out there with historic projects, especially historic projects that have that don't exist in original artwork form, you want to know what you're up against, give me a call and we'll talk. What else can I tell you?
I think that's I'm pretty good. That is a much more detailed trip into this process than I expected. Like I said, Sean, one, thank you again for your time on this, but it feels like real information that I can apply to everything I produce going forward, and even some stuff that hasn't left my hands yet, right, that I can do, redo and improve. So yeah, wow. I don't know. I think that's pretty good.
Well, the only other thing I'd say is just to keep in mind that these tools exist for us, and the same thing goes with working with printers. The same thing goes with selecting paper. These things exist so that we can have better representations of the things that we're making out there. And sometimes, like I said, it didn't take me any longer to produce that high resolution bitmapped image for your cover there than it would have if we were doing it at a low resolution space. It's just that the file that I'm saving is larger.
Right.
Well, I mean, storage space is basically free right now. I mean, what are we worried about hard drive space?
Whenever you're saving these files, like once you adjust that initial scan,
yeah,
are you saving them as like an uncompressed TIFF?
That's exactly it. Yeah. You can use there's a lossless compression you can use on TIFF. It's called LZW compression. So when you save, let's just go to save as. I'm gonna say save as TIFF, and you can see we've got an option for LZW compression, and that'll reduce your file size, but not have any kind of image impact at all. TIFF is basically, if you don't know, is basically like a container format. So there's lots of different image types that can be saved inside it. And if you hit JPEG, it's, even if it says TIFF on the end, it's still compressing it as a JPEG and hiding it inside of that container. I use TIFF, layered TIFF files instead of Photoshop files, just because I'm paranoid. TIFF is a global standard that everybody has access to, and the way that the file works is publicly available, and it's not going to change at any point. Whereas I don't trust necessarily that Adobe, 20 years from now isn't going to do something to a PSD where you have to update in order to use it, or some other thing along those lines. I feel like TIFF is just the safest way to go for that stuff. So any project that I work on, I basically have 3 different sets of files. I have the raw scans, I have the layered TIFF files that are all the ones that I've made script adjustments to. I've scripted them all out, and then I've cleaned them up. And then I have a bitmap folder that's all of the export, and that's done by script too. I just read a script that all it says is turn this into a 1-bit image file. And then I turn the script on, and it looks at the folder, and it puts all the images into the other folder. And like I said, I've worked with a few artists where they just want some tips on this. I just do a freelance rate with them, and I make them scripts, and that's something they can do themselves. That way they get control over the process. They can see what the script does. They can use it themselves. And then I'll just do a little bit of consultation with them and just say, yeah, that looks good. That doesn't look good. Don't do that. That type of stuff.
I may need to contact you whenever I start putting together this ballpoint pen.
Sure, be a pleasure. And like I said, scan them all in the same settings so that you can have the bulk of the work done for you.
Absolutely.
This is what we got computers for,
All right. Sean, where any plugs for yourself? Where should people find you?
Carson and I are Carson Grubaugh, who's the co-artist on Strange Death of Alex Raymond. He and I are doing a YouTube channel, and it's called Living the Line. And right now, a lot of book reviews and flip throughs and some tool talk in relationship to book reviews. So we'll take and dissect a certain technique and try to figure out what the tools are. And we're hoping at some point very soon to launch a Patreon, and also to try a few different series. One series might be a tech centered series where we go through some of these same types of things, but like basically take it topic by topic. I feel like I gave you the fire hose today.
It's a lot of information.
Right. And I apologize for that. I don't really know how to modulate the fire hose. Sometimes you got to just take one topic and just blast that one out instead. So this would be more like everything you need to know about color space, and then how to set up your scanner so that your scanner is getting accurate color, how to calibrate your monitor. All these are things that, you can do quickly if you know what you're doing, and improve everything that you do. Anyway, we're going to do that on our YouTube channel, and probably a Patreon. And if you guys, anybody watching this hasn't read The Strange Death of Alex Raymond, when it comes out in December 1st, I hope that you will do so. And I'm publishing books under Living the Line Books. And I'm also a freelance illustrator because there's not enough going on. livingtheline.com. You can check that out. And yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sean. Really appreciate it. For everybody watching at home, make more comics.